Salvador Dalí was one of the most eccentric and renowned artists of the 20th century, famed, of course, for his surrealistic work. He had a flamboyant personality. He popped up everywhere, and he had a way of self-promoting himself. But in this talk, I'll focus on his paintings rather than his idiosyncratic lifestyle. So he was born in Figueres, Catalonia in Spain in 1904, and his life started in a surreal way. He had an older brother who died 9 months before he was born, and his parents believed that Salvador was the reincarnation of his deceased sibling, although his father was a staunch atheist and his mother a devout Catholic. They gave him the same name, treated him as a reborn version of his deceased brother, and this bizarre belief affected him deeply, and he had an early interest in death, identity, and psychoanalysis. What we see here is the family. At the upper left, his aunt Maria Teresa, then his mother Felipa, his father also called Salvador, then the boy Salvador Dalí himself, his aunt Caterina, who later became his father's second wife, then his sister Anna Maria, and sitting his grandmother Anna. Dalí showed an extraordinary talent for art from an early age, and at 12 he began formal art lessons. This is his earliest known painting when he was 6, and he's already showing, I believe, a mature handling of paint. On the 6th of February 1921, Dalí's mother died of uterine cancer. He was only 16, and he later said, "His mother's death was the greatest blow I had experienced in my life. I worshipped her. I could not resign myself to the loss of a being on whom I counted to make invisible the unavoidable blemishes of my soul." As I said, after her death, his father married her sister. When he was 18, he moved to Madrid to study at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando. And being in Madrid, he visited the Prado, and this started a lifelong love of the great masters in the Prado. And every Sunday he would go there to study the old masters and sketch their work. This is an example of the type of work he was producing at that time, although it varied a great deal. Some of his paintings, like this one, show pointillist, some cubist, and others the influence of the Impressionists. By the way, all the works I'm going to show you are by Dalí, unless I state otherwise. Now, at the Academy, he befriended future creative artists like the filmmaker Luis Buñuel and the poet Federico Garcia Lorca. However, in 1926, his eccentric behaviour either got him expelled or he left of his own accord. It's not clear which. And he famously declared that the school, there was no one at the school who was competent enough to judge his work. And this is an example of his work that he produced at the time to demonstrate to himself his technical mastery. He painted it in the last few months that he was at the college, and he wanted to create this photographic intense realism that he associated with his role model Johannes Vermeer. And one consequence of him being expelled or walking out was that he didn't graduate, and that started to sour the relationship between him and his father, because his father viewed him as a failure from that point on. Now, in 1926, he visited Paris, met Pablo Picasso, Wang Gris, and their work deeply influenced him. And at this time, he started to blend Cubism with beginnings of surrealism. One example was actually a short film that he produced with Buñuel. It's called An Andalusian Dog, Un Chien Andalou. And it's famous for its dreamlight sequences. I mean, one of the most well-known sequences is a woman's eye is slashed with a razor. Another well-known image from the film is this one, a man pulling two grand pianos containing dead donkeys. And as you can see, there are two priests being pulled along as well. The film shocked audiences at the time, and that solidified his reputation in the surrealist circle. And here, for the first time, we see in 1929 Dali's mature symbolism. And it was the year that he met Gala, who at the time was married to the surrealist poet Paul Éluard. She was a Russian immigrant. She was 10 years older than him, and she became his muse, his lover, and eventually his wife. And it was Gala who was instrumental in managing his career. She was his business manager, and she managed to keep, not always very successfully, but she managed to keep a lot of his erratic, eccentric genius in check. This is The Great Masturbator, and the main part of the image is a representation of Dali's head in profile based on a prominent rock on the coast of where he lived. And it's also been suggested that it's a representation of this small rock in Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights, which is in the Prado. The eye, as you can see in the Bosch painting, is actually an imaginary multi-legged creature, and the mouth is a sort of a black lizard crawling over the rock. Coming back to Dali's painting, underneath the head you can see a giant grasshopper. Dali had a fear of insects. He feared all insects, but particularly grasshoppers, bees and ants. And I'll explain more about ants later. You can see ants in this painting. At the top right, there's a profile of Gala's head shown next to a man's genitalia with obvious sexual connotations. And the painting, particularly with the title, The Great Masturbator, is a portrayal of the conflicted feelings he had regarding sexual attraction and a fear of any sexual encounter. In fact, that fear is partly fostered by the fact that when he was young, his father showed him photographs, gave him a book with photographs of genitalia of people suffering from advanced untreated venereal disease in order to, quotes, educate him. The images horrified and fascinated the young Dali, and from then on he associated sex with disease and decay. This is another surreal work, The Enigma of Desire, My Mother, My Mother, My Mother. It was the first work that he sold at his first solo exhibition. It's a Catalonian landscape with two figures on the far left embracing or merging together, and below them we can see the profile, the same profile of a head again, and each depression in the rocky outcrop says my mother. As I said, his mother died when he was 17. His father married his sister, but Dalí carried a yearning for his mother with him for the rest of his life. Having said that, in 1929, the same year, he drew a blasphemous image of the Sacred Heart representing Christ, and the title of the painting, which was written on the painting, was "Sometimes I spit with pleasure on the portrait of my mother, the Sacred Heart." His father demanded he withdraw the painting and the title, but he refused. His father disowned him, disinherited him, and told him never to return to his hometown. Again, you can see in this painting ants. I said I'd explain ants a bit further. He explains in his autobiography that when he was a child, one day he came across an injured bat, one that was unable to fly. So he lifted up the poor creature, took it into a shed in order to keep it safe overnight. And then he came down in the morning to feed it with some milk and found it being eaten alive by ants. He said he was overcome with pity for the poor creature and lifted it up to his mouth. A traumatic event which from then on he associated ants with the horror of pain, decay and death, and combined with the book he'd seen on venereal diseases, ants became associated with sexual desire. So he tells us that on a number of occasions he used ants in this way. He regarded them with horror, but they did become one of his most important and creative symbols. This is one of his best known, most widely recognised work, The Persistence of Memory. He once explained this picture represented a landscape near Port Ligat. Port Ligat was near his hometown, where he bought a studio which he then extended, and he lived there. The Port Ligat rocks were lighted in this picture by a transparent and melancholy twilight, he said. And he added, in the foreground, an olive tree with branches cut and without leaves. Now, he frequently described his paintings as hand-painted dream photographs. And the upper right corner in this shows the cliffs, which can be recognised, of Cape du Crius, a peninsula near where he lived. And he described that aspect of the painting as the usual paralysing tricks of eye falling. So you can see from those comments about photographs and eye falling that it was his intention to represent things photographically, but the things he represented were things from his subconscious mind. And in order to elicit those things from his subconscious, he developed a technique that he called paranoid critical method. And what he would do is he would enter a state of a sort of a form of self-hypnosis and create spontaneous sketches without thinking about what he was doing. And then later he would come back to them and look at them and try and draw out the unexpected shapes and symbols that were that he found by analysing these automatic drawings. He added once that the difference between a madman and me is that I'm not mad. Critics, incidentally, have seen the melting clocks as a reference to Einstein's special theory of relativity, the way in which time can run more slowly for different observers. But once when Dalí was asked, he said they were inspired by camembert cheese melting in the sun. So who knows? Note again the ants on the orange clock on the far left, and the soft object on the ground, which is another version of the face we've just seen. The ghost of Vermeer of Delft, which can be used as a table. This is a reference to Vermeer's The Art of Painting, this work, which is believed to contain a back view of Vermeer himself painting, and it's one of a number of paintings that express Dalí's enormous admiration for Vermeer. He shows Vermeer with an outstretched leg forming a table on which he's placed a bottle and a glass. The walls and the mountains in the distance are based on a location near his home in Portligat. And he often used at this time anthropomorphic furniture and crutches. They were symbols that he used at this period of his career. And he would distort, and he was fascinated with the way in which organic objects like people could be distorted and combined and merged with inanimate objects. It's possible he was implying that great artists like Vermeer over time become commodities like a table, the way we deal with them. In 1934, the year this was painted, Gala divorced the surrealist poet Paul Éluard and married Dalí. And it was the same year that he was expelled from the surrealist movement. The surrealists were disliked a number of aspects. They disliked his fascination with the fascist leaders. They didn't like the way that he promoted himself. They didn't like his growing fame, and his relationship with the leader of the surrealists, known as the Pope of Surrealism, André Breton, went from bad to worse, and he was expelled, he was told, for his behaviour, which was described as contrary to surrealism. Dalí's comment was, "The only difference between me and the surrealists is that I am a surrealist." He painted this some 6 months before the Spanish Civil War. And he and his wife, Gala, were trapped in the middle of a general strike in Catalonia. There was an armed uprising, which may have inspired this painting. They managed to escape to Paris, and when he eventually returned home to Portligat, he found that his home had been destroyed in the war. More seriously, he was deeply affected by the death of his friend Federico Garcia Lorca, who was executed by a fascist firing squad, and the death of his sister Anna Maria, who was imprisoned and tortured by the communists. So he lost friends and relations to both sides of the conflict. Spain was tearing itself apart. This work was exhibited in New York at the Museum of Modern Art and at a solo exhibition in New York, and both exhibitions received wide coverage, and he was later described as a vast or this was a vast human body breaking out into monstrous excrements of arms and legs, tearing at one another in a delirium of auto-strangulation. That was Dali's description of what we see in this painting. Also, it was in 1936 that he gave a series of lectures at the International Surrealist Exhibition in London, and he wore a deep-sea diving suit. The intention was to represent the idea that he was descending into the depths of the subconscious. Unfortunately, he almost suffocated to death. There was no oxygen in the suit. It was extremely hot. He started to run out of air, and the engineer who had bolted the helmet onto the deep sea suit with a spanner had disappeared. No one could find him. The audience thought that the attempts to get him out were all part of the act, until somebody realised that it was serious and rushed forward. They managed to find a hammer, and they started hitting the nuts with this hammer, which of course completely disoriented Dalí inside. But they managed to loosen the nuts with the hammer and eventually get off the helmet and saved his life. This is one of his greatest works. It's at the Tate. It's called Autumnal Cannibalism. And it needs quite a lot of description. There's a lot of symbolism and a lot going on in this work. What we see is two sort of distorted torsos on top of a chest of drawers. And if you look at the figures in more detail, you can see they're eating each other using bright silver cutlery. The figure, let me point. This figure on the left looks feminine, as it's a lighter colour to this figure on the right, which is wearing a sort of a suit. The arm of the figure on the left here comes around to this hand, which is holding a knife, which is cutting into what at first glance you think is the figure on the right. But if you follow it back, you see it's the breast of the woman on the left. Her breast flows across to the other figure and she's carving from it. So sadism, masochism, cannibalism, self-cannibalism are in this painting. It's a painting about a country, Spain, devouring itself. And Dalí draws us into the horror by adding detail upon detail, encouraging our eyes to penetrate further and further until we're encompassed and consumed by the painting ourselves. It was painted in 1936, when the year the Spanish Civil War started, and there were atrocities on both sides. 500,000 people died and a similar number fled the country. Now, Dalí himself wasn't political. He saw the Civil War as an orgy of self-inflicted pain, the Spanish people eating themselves. He wrote these Iberian beings mutually devouring each other, which he saw as pure phenomenon of natural history. In other words, a sort of inevitability, something that humanity is destined to fall into, compared with the view of Picasso, who considered the Spanish War a political phenomenon and produced Guernica as if you like, an anti-war painting. But Dalí saw it, you might imagine that he saw it the same way that a scientist might observe the behaviour of ants. And in fact, in the painting, you can see there are ants here surrounding this torn flesh. Or is it torn flesh? Because underneath it's not bright red. It looks like the flesh of a fruit, and part of the skin of the fruit is been flailed off, and the ants are eating the sweet fruit underneath. The drawers, incidentally, and this tongue here nailed to the open drawer is something that I'll explain in a moment. Let me, for this painting, just explain the symbolism of the apple on top. It represents the apple used by William Tell. Now, William Tell was a Swiss hero who resisted Austrian rule and was made to fire a crossbow at an apple resting on his son's head. Now, as I said, in 1930, his father had broken off relationships, and Dalí described William Tell as the man whose success depends upon his son's heroism. So his reference to William Tell is a symbolic representation of his intense family conflict, the conflict between him and his father, which in Freudian terms it represents the father castrating the son. His father, of course, as I said, was dismayed initially by Dalí becoming expelled from art school as he saw it, his increasingly scandalous behaviour and his relationship with Gala. His father had actually died 2 years before this was painted in 1934, and they never reconciled. Another well-known painting at the Tate, The Metamorphosis of Narcissus, another painting with many aspects to it. Let me start in the background. The painting's in a number of parts. If we start over here, we see this sort of part of what looks like a chessboard with a figure on a pedestal representing Narcissus, isolated, as the only person he loves is himself. And to his left, over here, we see in the background a group of 8 naked figures that Dalí called the heterosexuals. There are 8 women described as Hindu, Catalan, German, Russian, American, Swedish and English. And we are to assume they're the former lovers of Narcissus. Now, in the foreground, we see here Narcissus in warm colours, his head in his hand, the warm colours accentuated by this red glow behind him. And on the right here, we see a hand in cold colours holding an egg, the symbol of life, from which sprouts a narcissus plant. Now, just to explain briefly the story behind it, Narcissus is a story from the mythology of ancient Greece. He was such a great beauty that all the women fell in love with him as soon as they saw him, including the nymph Echo, and he never returned their love, as he was only in love with himself. Echo was so distressed that she hid in a cave and could not be found, could only be heard, her voice distantly echoing in the background. Now the gods became annoyed with this behaviour, decided to punish Narcissus by allowing him to see his reflection in a pond for the first time. This was the first time he'd seen himself, and he immediately fell in love with his image and couldn't tear his eyes away, and in the end died of frustration. The gods then felt sorry for him and changed his body into a narcissus or daffodil flower. So that's what Dalí is representing here. His fixation in the water, the fire of passion, the head resting on the knee becomes turned into a hand holding an egg. Although some say it's Echo's fossilised hand holding the last remnants of Narcissus reborn as a flower. What Dalí said is, there remains of him only the hallucinatingly white oval of his head held up by the tips of the water's fingers. When that head slits, when the head splits, when the head bursts, it will be the flower the new Narcissus. And again, Dalí described his painting style as hand-painted colour photography. But of course, it's not a photograph of any scene you have seen or could see. It's a dream or perhaps a nightmare. And he called this ability to paint his dreams, his, as I said, his paranoid critical method. And this is perhaps the first painting where he used this approach to the full. This one, Swans Reflecting Elephants, contains his famous double images, which he also used in his paintings and were part of his method, which incidentally he describes. He's written quite a lot in his 1935 essay, The Conquest of the Irrational. He describes the method, although sometimes his descriptions are a bit hard to interpret. For example, he writes, it's a spontaneous method of irrational understanding based upon the interpretive critical association of delirious phenomena. Well, what we see here are three swans, 1, 2, 3, in front of a bleak, leafless trees, reflected in the lake. So the swans' necks become the trunks of elephants, their wings become the ears of the elephants, and the trunks of the trees become the legs of the elephants. Incidentally, you might have noticed this man standing over here. He hasn't been identified. It could be Dalí himself. That's been mentioned as a possibility. It could be also been mentioned. It could be his friend Marcel Duchamp. The burning giraffe. But in the foreground, we see a woman's body with open drawers. I said I would return to the symbolism of drawers. Dalí tells us that when he was young, he went into his parents' bedroom, which he wasn't meant to enter, and he opened a drawer and found inside what he describes as personal and intimate items that were both mysterious and unsettling to him. And the experience deeply impacted him and led him to view drawers as symbols of hidden secrets, the unconscious and private aspects of the human psyche. And Dalí, by the way, was fascinated, I think I said earlier, by Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theories. And he deeply shared his approach, and it shaped his art. Freud's idea, of course, was that the mind is composed of the deep primitive id, the moral conscience. We have the superego, he called it, and the ego, the realistic part that mediates between the desires of the id and the constraints of the superego. The id being represented by the drawers which, when open, reveal the secret desires that we all have. Incidentally, I should comment on the burning giraffe. We don't know exactly what it represents. Dalí describes it as a male cosmic apocalyptic monster, and it's generally been interpreted as a symbol representing humanity's self-destructive tendencies that show themselves in violence and in war. This is Impressions of Africa. The title's a bit misleading, as it's not a depiction of Africa. He'd never visited Africa. It's a psychological landscape where Dalí is projecting his childhood fears and fantasies and memories. The term Africa he's just using because of its associations with the exotic and the mysterious. He used his paranoid critical method to access irrational thoughts and subconscious imagery, and the landscape is filled with hidden faces, animal forms and objects that seem to morph one into another. Let me give you an example. over here we can see a portrait of Gala, and her eyes, you can see, morph into these Moorish archways. But if we go along, above her head, there's the wing of a dead partridge. To the left of these Moorish arches, we see a cave. And to the left of the cave, looking very similar, but there's a trunk here, we see a tree. And in front of the tree, you can just make out a head here and two arms and a costume here of a monk with outstretched arms. And you move over to the left and you can see a head here, outstretched arms again, another representation of the monk, which of course immediately morphs into the head of a donkey. Now, Dalí painted this just before World War II, and while the Spanish Civil War was tearing Spain apart. He'd exiled himself initially to Paris, and then he went to the United States with Gala, and he felt disconnected from his homeland and anxious about the state of Spain, which is reflected in this painting, Impressions of Africa. It's a fragmented and alien landscape, a metaphor for his psychological dislocation. Incidentally, it was in 1938, the year he painted this, that he met Sigmund Freud for the first and I believe the only time. Dalí showed Freud some of his paintings, and although initially Freud was sceptical because of Dalí's flamboyant personality and reputation, he was impressed by the artist's ability to visualize and represent the workings of the unconscious mind. And Dalí himself was inspired by the meeting, and I guess Freud expressed what you might call cautious admiration. The Face of War. It's a powerful and disturbing painting, creating during his self-imposed exile in the United States. It was painted in 1940, so just following the Spanish Civil War and the onset of World War II, and it encapsulates his horror of war and human suffering. He lived in the US for 8 years. He became a household name in the US. He mingled with celebrities, held exhibitions, worked with other artists. For example, this is a dream sequence he designed for the Alfred Hitchcock's film Spellbound, and Dalí even appeared on the cover of Time magazine. So he became, as I said, a household name. Now, while in the US, he painted under the influence of Freud's theories, and this is another example of his symbolic representation of Freud's theories. It's called Dream Caused by the Flight of a Bee Around a Pomegranate a Second Before Awakening. And he imagined a dream triggered by the buzz of a bee. And as I said, in childhood, he had intense fear of insects, and he had a bee phobia, which he traced back to his early years, where he became hypersensitive to the buzzing of bees. He couldn't stand it. So he associated bees with irrational fears. And so in this painting, it's the bee is a catalyst for the entire surreal scene, symbolizing his anxieties. The nude figure in the foreground is his wife Gala, and the sound of the fearful bee in the second before awakening has created what I see as the horror of his beloved wife being violently killed by two tigers, and as you can see, a bayonet. One tiger is erupting from the mouth of a fish, which is coming from the centre of a pomegranate, which itself is a symbol of life and death. And the elephant with its long spindly legs is a recurring motif, a symbol that he often used, and it suggests, I think, the fragility and instability of what appears to us the most powerful of animals, and it reflects Dali's vulnerability, and in this case his inability to protect Gala. A religious painting, one of his early religious paintings, 1946, The Temptation of Saint Anthony. It's a striking painting. It represents temptation, spirituality, human frailty through the lens of surrealism, and was created as part of a competition organised by the Low Lurwin Company for inclusion in a film called The Private Affairs of Belle Amie, based on the novel Belle Amie by Guy de Maupassant. Although Dalí didn't win, this remains one of his celebrated works. Now, Saint Anthony was a Christian monk who became associated with and was a symbol of asceticism and resistance to worldly temptations. And so in Christian art, he's often shown being tempted and being tempted by demons who are offering him lascivious women, wealth and power, which is what we see here. He's holding up a cross as an act of defiance against these towering, nightmarish figures that threaten to overwhelm him. The elephants symbolise the fragile nature of temptation and desire, and they're carrying symbols of wealth, power and sensuality, the classic temptations of lust, greed and pride. And the rearing horse, I think, symbolises aggression, the destructive nature of power, a reference to the wars, the Spanish Civil War and the World War II. And now in the late 1930s, he'd broken with the surrealist group, as I said, and he began to explore religious themes. And this painting is a transitional moment when he's blending surrealist techniques with some spiritual and moral themes. This is not a religious painting. Leda Atomica combines a portrait of his wife Gala, whom he idolised, with his a deep interest in atomic physics and mythology. So the painting depicts Leda, a figure from Greek mythology, here represented by Gala, and Leda was seduced by Zeus, who took the form of a swan to seduce her. Now, Dalí's interpretation is slightly different from the normal sexual encounter that artists show. He's showing Gala floating as if disconnected and independent of the world, and almost above and beyond and taming Zeus. He captures in this painting the interplay between the divine and the earthly, the scientific and the mystical, and the personal and the universal. And by suspending every element in this delicate balance, he's created an otherworldly calm which reflects his post-war view of the world as atomized yet intricately connected, where nothing is quite what it seems. Incidentally, it was painted, of course, a few years after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the floating objects could represent this disintegration of the old world view. A form of religious painting. The first version is the one on the left, the smaller one, the Madonna of Port Ligat, and it was presented to Pope Pius VII in an audience he asked for and was granted for the approval of the painting. It's fairly small. And a year later, in 1950, he created a much larger version, about 2 meters high, the one I'm showing on the right. And this, he's interested in religion, which began in the 1940s, he grew increasingly fascinated both with religion and with atomic physics and the merger between the two. I should say that he described himself as a Catholic without faith, so he wasn't by any means a conventional Catholic. And this painting combines his unique symbolism, his complex relationship with Catholicism, and his fascination with Catholic theory. And he referred to this blend of his personal symbols with atomic theory and Catholicism as nuclear mysticism. Madonna, of course, is represented here by Gala, his wife, who he regarded as a divine figure. And the background is actually a view of Port Ligat, the small fishing village he lived in Catalonia. Another atomic exploded view. This is Galatea of the Spheres, it's called. Another example of nuclear mysticism. She's shown as atomic objects, atoms flying apart, representing her as a timeless beauty, in the form of continual atomic flux flooding out. And you could interpret this disintegration as linked to his personal search for meaning in the post-war world, where everything, society, spirituality, were being questioned and reimagined. And this Galatea of the Spheres represents his belief that art, science and religion are all interconnected paths to the understanding of our universe. Now, by 1954, he'd fully embraced Catholicism, although, of course, on his own terms. And this reflects his desire to depict the divine in a way that transcends traditional representations. The most distinctive feature of this painting is the crucifix, which is represented not as a traditional cross, but as a three-dimensional unfolding of a four-dimensional hypercube known as a tesseract. And this geometric shape, a cube extended into the fourth dimension, symbolized for him the higher spiritual reality beyond human comprehension. So what he's saying is that the crucifix is not just a historical event, but it's a cosmic event that exists or existed in another dimension, the spiritual world beyond the physical world. And standing at the foot, he's shown Gala dressed in contemporary attire representing the Virgin Mary. This is the sacrament of the Last Supper, reflecting again his deeply Catholic faith and his fascination with atomic theory, which is blended together. He shows the disciples and Jesus around the table. He's modelled Christ after his own image and shows him in this vast light-filled seascape, connecting the divine to his personal experience of transcendence. You can see that Christ and the disciples are inside this geometric dodecahedron, which is a polyhedron with 12 flat faces, symbolizing divine perfection. Now, the dodecahedron, each face is a five-sided pentagon, and Plato believed the first four faces correspond to the elements of the material world, earth, fire, air and water, and the fifth is the quintessence, which is the element of heaven. So Dalí is reflecting the harmony of science and spirituality, a central theme of what he called nuclear mysticism. Slightly different set of symbols and meanings here. The discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus himself is a reinterpretation of Dalí. It's a large painting, over 4 meters tall, and it was commissioned for the Huntington Hartford Gallery in New York, and reflects his desire to celebrate Spain's role in world history. And it was created and inspired by the Catholic faith and represents what he saw as Spain taking the Catholic faith and spreading it to the New World. So he's representing Spain as in its historic guise as conquerors and crusaders taking the faith to the New World. On the banner on the left, he's depicting Gala draped in these pure white robes symbolizing purity, vision, and the divine mission, as the figure on the banner that's being created by Dalí, representing Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of the New World, but also Dalí as the discoverer in the realm of art, science and religion combined. And the final work I wanted to show you is the hallucinogenic Toreador, regarded as his last great masterpieces. He continued to paint until his death in 1989, but the death of Gala in 1982 deeply affected him, and his later works after this one, like The Swallow's Tail, are often seen as less important than his earlier works. His health, incidentally, was deteriorating as well, and his work became increasingly reflective and personal. Now, this painting stands, I think, at the culmination of his lifelong interest in surrealism, science, religion, optical illusion, and personal mythology and symbolism. And it compresses together, it synthesizes his technical prowess, his ability to layer meaning upon meaning. At the centre of the painting, we see these receding images of the Venus de Milo as a form of optical illusion and representing beauty. And when viewed at a distance, the figures of Venus de Milo reveal the face and body of a bullfighter. And so he's manipulating the classical beauty into a figure of a toreador. And it represents his view that perception isn't something that's fixed, but something that is subjective. So reality is something that is shaped by the mind's ability to see appearances beyond the basic form of reality. The central form of the toreador is based on a well-known Spanish bullfighter. So it's a sort of homage of the Spanish tradition of bullfighting and a commentary on death and sacrifice. Gala appears small, upper left, aloof and pensive, almost a sort of separate divine observer. And in the foreground, bottom left, you can see a bull appears, a traditional Spanish symbol of violence, passion and death. And the bull's head merges with the rocks of the landscape of his home in Ligat. So the final, and I think most touching element of the painting is bottom right, where a small young boy representing Dali's childhood. It's like the young Dalí looking at his life's work with curiosity and wonder. Now, as I said, I've concentrated on his paintings, but he, of course, lived an exciting and controversial life. Some of those things I've mentioned, but many aspects of his personal life I've skipped over or omitted. So I hope that through his paintings I've given you some insight into his extraordinary nightmares and visions. So thank you for now for your time and attention. Goodbye for now.